In the Swat Valley of Pakistan, where mountains rise like ancient guardians and the river flows with stories of generations past, a young girl named Malala Yousafzai grew up in a world where education was considered a privilege rather than a right. She was born on July 12, 1997, into a family that valued learning above all else. Her father, Ziauddin Yousafzai, was an educator who ran a chain of schools and believed passionately that every child, regardless of gender, deserved the chance to learn and grow. Her mother, Torpekai, though not formally educated herself, supported her daughter's dreams with unwavering love and encouragement. From the very beginning, Malala was different from many girls in her community. While other families celebrated the birth of sons and mourned the arrival of daughters, her father rejoiced at her birth and named her after Malalai of Maiwand, a legendary Afghan heroine who rallied troops during battle. This name carried weight and expectation, but it also carried hope for a future where girls could be heroes in their own right. Growing up in Mingora, the main city of Swat Valley, Malala experienced a childhood filled with the joy of learning. She attended her father's school, where she excelled in her studies and competed fiercely with her classmates for top marks. Education was not just a routine for her but a passion that burned brightly in her young heart. She loved books, loved the feeling of discovering new ideas, and loved the way knowledge opened doors to understanding the world beyond her valley. Her father encouraged this passion, often taking her to school events and allowing her to speak her mind freely, something that was uncommon for girls in their conservative society. He treated her not as a possession to be protected and hidden away, but as a thinking, feeling individual with valuable ideas worth hearing. This upbringing gave Malala a confidence that would later become her greatest strength and, in some eyes, her greatest danger. The Swat Valley had once been a peaceful tourist destination, known for its natural beauty and welcoming people. Families would vacation there, enjoying the cool mountain air and the warmth of local hospitality. But as Malala grew older, dark clouds began gathering over her homeland. A militant group began gaining power in the region, bringing with them strict interpretations of religious law that threatened the very fabric of daily life. They began imposing rules that particularly targeted women and girls, viewing education for females as a threat to their ideology. At first, the changes were subtle, whispers of disapproval and quiet warnings. But soon the threats became louder and more violent. Schools for girls were attacked, buildings were bombed, and teachers who dared to continue educating girls received death threats. The militants used radio broadcasts to spread their message of fear, listing names of those who defied their orders and promising brutal consequences. Malala watched as her world transformed from a place of learning and growth into a landscape of fear and oppression. One by one, her classmates stopped coming to school. Their families, terrified of the consequences, chose to keep their daughters at home where they would be safe from the militants' wrath. The streets that had once been filled with the chatter of schoolgirls became quieter, emptier. Many families fled Swat Valley entirely, seeking safety in other parts of Pakistan or abroad. Those who remained lived under the constant shadow of violence, never knowing when the next attack might come or who might be targeted next. The militants banned television, music, and dancing. They destroyed shops that sold DVDs and beauty products. They enforced their version of morality with public punishments that left the community traumatized and silent. Women were ordered to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary, and when they did venture out, they had to be fully covered and accompanied by male relatives. Despite the growing danger, Malala and her father made a choice that would change their lives forever. They decided not to stay silent. When a BBC reporter contacted Ziauddin looking for someone to write a blog about life under militant rule, Malala, at just 11 years old, volunteered. She would write under a pseudonym, sharing her experiences and her fears with the world beyond Swat Valley. She wrote about the sounds of gunfire at night, about the fear that gripped her heart when she walked to school, about the classrooms that grew emptier with each passing week. She wrote about wanting to learn, about refusing to let fear steal her dreams, about believing that education was worth fighting for even when the cost seemed impossibly high. Her words were simple but powerful, the voice of a child caught in circumstances beyond her control, yet refusing to surrender her future. The blog gained attention, and people around the world began to learn about the situation in Swat Valley through Malala's eyes. As her blog grew in popularity, Malala began speaking more publicly about girls' education. She gave interviews to journalists, appeared on television programs, and attended conferences where she shared her story with audiences who listened with growing concern and admiration. Her father stood beside her, supporting her activism even as the threats against them intensified. They both knew the risks, understood that every public appearance made them more visible to those who wanted to silence dissent. Yet they continued because they believed the cause was greater than their individual safety. Malala became a symbol of resistance, a young face representing millions of girls denied their right to education. She received awards and recognition, including Pakistan's first National Youth Peace Prize. Her fame grew, and with it, so did the anger of those who saw her as a dangerous threat to their power and ideology. The militants took notice of this brave young girl who dared to defy their orders and speak out against their cruel restrictions. Her name appeared on their target lists, and threats against her became more specific and more menacing. Friends warned her family to be careful, to perhaps consider leaving SWAT or at least keeping Malala out of the public eye for a while. But Malala felt she had gone too far to turn back now. She believed deeply that someone needed to speak for the girls who had lost their voices, for the classrooms that sat empty, for the future that was being stolen from an entire generation. She gave interviews where she calmly discussed the possibility of being attacked, showing a maturity and courage far beyond her years. When asked if she was afraid, she acknowledged the fear but said it would not stop her from speaking the truth. Her mother worried constantly, performing prayers for her daughter's safety, while her father wrestled with guilt over encouraging Malala's activism even as pride swelled in his heart for her bravery. Life continued in this strange balance of normalcy and danger. Malala went to school when it was safe, studied for her exams, laughed with friends, and dreamed of becoming a doctor or politician who could help her country. She was still a child in many ways, enjoying simple pleasures and experiencing typical teenage concerns about grades and friendships. Yet she also carried the heavy burden of being a public figure in a war zone, knowing that her words and actions could have serious consequences. The Pakistani military had conducted operations to push the militants out of Swat Valley, and for a time, life seemed to be returning to normal. Schools reopened, shops resumed business, and families began to hope that the worst was behind them. But beneath the surface, danger still lurked, and those who had spoken out against the militants remained marked targets. Malala continued her education and her activism, believing that the world was watching and that international attention would provide some protection. She could not have known that the most dangerous chapter of her story was about to begin, that her courage would soon be tested in the most horrific way imaginable, and that her life would be forever changed by the violence she had long feared but refused to let silence her voice. On October 9, 2012, a day that would become etched in history, Malala boarded her school bus as she had done countless times before. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in Mingora, and she had just finished taking her exams at school. The bus was filled with her classmates, all chattering and laughing as teenage girls do, relieved that another day of tests was behind them. The vehicle made its way through the familiar streets of their city, passing shops and homes that Malala had known all her life. Nobody on that bus could have imagined what was about to happen, though later many would remember feeling an unusual tension in the air that morning. The driver navigated the route carefully, aware that even though the military operations had supposedly cleared the area of militants, danger could still appear without warning. The girls sat squeezed together on the benches, their school bags piled around them, discussing their answers to exam questions and making plans for the upcoming holiday break. Suddenly, the bus came to a stop. A young man jumped onto the vehicle, his face partially covered. He asked a question that sent chills through everyone present, wanting to know which one of them was Malala. For a brief moment, there was confused silence. Some of the girls instinctively looked toward Malala, and that glance was enough. The gunman raised his pistol and fired 3 shots at close range. One bullet hit Malala in the left side of her head, traveling through her skull and lodging near her shoulder. The other bullet struck 2 of her friends who were sitting beside her. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, and screams filled the air as the gunman fled. Malala slumped forward, blood pouring from her wounds, unconscious before she even realized what had happened. Her friends were hysterical, calling for help, crying, trying to understand the horror that had just unfolded. The bus driver, shaking with shock and fear, drove as fast as he could to the nearest hospital, while the girls tried desperately to keep Malala conscious, talking to her, begging her to stay awake. At the hospital in Mingora, doctors quickly realized that Malala's injuries were far too severe for their facilities to handle. She needed specialized neurosurgical care that simply was not available in Swat Valley. Her father arrived at the hospital in a state of panic, having heard that his daughter had been shot but not knowing the extent of her injuries. When he saw her, lying unconscious with blood-soaked bandages around her head, he felt his world collapsing. Her mother arrived soon after, and together they prayed while doctors worked frantically to stabilize Malala enough for transport to a better-equipped hospital. The news of the attack spread rapidly through Pakistan and around the world. People were horrified that militants would target a child, that they would attempt to murder a young girl whose only crime was wanting to go to school and encouraging others to do the same. The attack was condemned by people of all backgrounds and beliefs, and suddenly Malala's name was on everyone's lips, not just as an education activist, but as a victim of senseless violence. Malala was transferred to a military hospital in Peshawar, where army doctors with combat medical experience took over her care. They performed emergency surgery to remove part of her skull to relieve the pressure on her swelling brain, a procedure that undoubtedly saved her life. She remained in critical condition, unconscious and unresponsive, breathing only with the help of machines. Her parents stayed by her side, refusing to leave, watching every monitor and waiting for any sign of improvement. Messages of support poured in from around the world. Vigils were held in cities across the globe, with people gathering to pray for Malala's recovery and to protest the violence that had nearly killed her. The Pakistani government, facing international pressure and domestic outrage, arranged for Malala to be airlifted to the United Kingdom for specialized treatment. She was flown to Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, one of the best facilities in the world for treating traumatic brain injuries and gunshot wounds. The journey to Birmingham was touch and go, with medical staff monitoring her constantly during the flight, prepared for any emergency. When she arrived in England, a team of expert surgeons and neurologists took over her care. For days, she remained unconscious while doctors assessed the full extent of her injuries. The bullet had done significant damage, but miraculously, it had missed the major blood vessels in her brain. Her chances of survival, which had seemed impossibly slim in those first hours after the shooting, began to improve slowly. Her parents arrived in Birmingham, navigating a foreign country while dealing with the trauma of nearly losing their daughter. They were grateful for the medical care she was receiving, but felt lost and frightened in this unfamiliar place. Meanwhile, back in Pakistan, the two other girls who had been injured in the attack were also receiving treatment. The world watched and waited, hoping for news that Malala would survive and recover. After several days in a medically induced coma, Malala began to wake up. She opened her eyes in a hospital room thousands of miles from home, confused and disoriented, unable to speak because of the breathing tube in her throat. She tried to communicate through writing, and her first questions were asking what had happened, where she was, and where her father was. When she learned she was in England, she worried about the cost of the medical care, a concern so typical of her character that it brought tears to those around her. As the breathing tube was removed and she regained the ability to speak, the full extent of what she had survived began to become clear. She had been shot in the head by militants who wanted to kill her for speaking out about education, and yet she was alive. Her survival seemed nothing short of miraculous to the doctors who treated her. They explained that she would need more surgeries to repair her skull and to address the damage to her facial nerve, which had left the left side of her face partially paralyzed. She would need months of rehabilitation and therapy. But she was alive, and her mind was intact, and that was more than anyone had dared to hope for in those dark first days after the attack. As Malala's condition stabilized and improved, she began to understand the global response to what had happened to her. The shooting had sparked international outrage and brought unprecedented attention to the cause she had been fighting for, the right of all children, particularly girls, to receive an education. World leaders had condemned the attack, and millions of people who had never heard of Malala before now knew her story and supported her mission. She received thousands of cards and letters from well-wishers around the world, messages of support from children and adults alike who were inspired by her courage and horrified by the violence she had endured. In Pakistan, there were protests against the militants and calls for stronger action to protect children and schools. Some people criticized her and her family, claiming they had sought attention and brought the attack upon themselves, but these voices were largely drowned out by the overwhelming support. The United Nations declared November 10 as Malala Day, and she was nominated for numerous international awards recognizing her activism and bravery. Recovery was a long and painful process that tested Malala's strength in ways she had never imagined. The physical wounds were only part of the challenge she faced. She had to relearn how to perform basic tasks, how to walk steadily again, how to coordinate her movements, how to deal with the constant headaches and the hearing loss in her left ear. The paralysis on the left side of her face affected her ability to smile and blink, requiring additional surgeries to repair the facial nerve. She underwent multiple operations, including one to fit a titanium plate to reconstruct her skull and another to insert a cochlear implant to restore hearing in her damaged ear. Each surgery came with its own risks and recovery period, and each one required courage and patience. Her parents stayed with her throughout this ordeal, living in Birmingham while her younger brothers remained in Pakistan with relatives. The separation from her whole family, from her home, from everything familiar, added an emotional burden to the physical pain she was enduring. The psychological impact of surviving an assassination attempt would have broken many people, especially someone so young. Malala experienced nightmares and moments of fear, but she refused to let the attack define her or destroy her spirit. She was determined not only to recover, but to continue the work that had nearly cost her life. During her rehabilitation, she thought often about the other girls in Pakistan and around the world who were still being denied education, who were still living in fear, who needed someone to speak for them. She thought about her friends who had been injured in the attack alongside her, and she felt a responsibility to make sure their suffering had meaning. As she grew stronger, she began to believe that surviving the attack gave her an even greater platform and responsibility to advocate for change. The militants had tried to silence her, but instead they had amplified her voice to reach corners of the world she had never imagined possible. While still recovering, Malala began speaking out again. In February 2013, just 4 months after the attack, she was well enough to begin attending school in Birmingham. Her family had decided to remain in England, at least temporarily, where Malala could continue her education safely while maintaining her advocacy work. Attending a British school was a new experience for her, with different teaching methods, different social dynamics, and the challenge of being the most famous student in the building. Her classmates tried to treat her normally, but it was impossible to ignore the security measures that surrounded her or the media attention that followed her everywhere. She worked hard to catch up on the schooling she had missed during her recovery, driven by the same passion for learning that had always defined her. Education was not just a cause for Malala but a personal love, and being back in a classroom felt like reclaiming a part of herself that the attackers had tried to take away. In July 2013, on her 16th birthday, Malala addressed the United Nations in New York City. Standing before world leaders and diplomats, wearing a shawl that had belonged to Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan who had also been assassinated, Malala delivered a speech that resonated around the globe. She spoke about the importance of education, about the power of peaceful protest, about the need for every child to have access to school regardless of gender, religion, or economic status. Her words were powerful and eloquent, expressing ideas with a clarity and passion that moved her audience deeply. She declared that the terrorists thought they could change her aims and stop her ambitions, but nothing changed in her life except that weakness, fear, and hopelessness died, and strength, power, and courage were born. She emphasized that one child, one teacher, one book, and one pen could change the world, a phrase that would become one of her most quoted statements. The speech was met with a standing ovation, and Malala Day was officially recognized by the United Nations. Following her UN address, Malala and her father established the Malala Fund, an organization dedicated to advocating for girls' education worldwide and supporting local education activists in countries where girls face the greatest barriers to schooling. The fund began working in regions including Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Nigeria, and other countries where cultural, economic, or political factors prevented girls from attending school. They funded programs to build schools, train teachers, and provide resources for girls who wanted to learn but lacked the means. The organization also worked to influence policy at national and international levels, pushing governments to prioritize education in their budgets and to remove legal and social barriers that kept girls out of classrooms. Malala became the face of global education advocacy, but she was careful to emphasize that she was not working alone, that there were countless activists, teachers, and students around the world fighting the same fight, and that her role was to amplify their voices and their work. The recognition and awards continued to accumulate. Malala received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought from the European Parliament, the Amnesty International Ambassador of Conscience Award, and numerous honorary degrees from universities around the world. She met with presidents, prime ministers, and other world leaders, using each opportunity to press the case for education and to share stories of girls who were still being denied their right to learn. Some criticized her for becoming too westernized, for being used as a tool by foreign governments, or for not doing enough to address other issues in Pakistan. These criticisms stung, especially those that came from her own countrymen, but she tried to focus on the work rather than the controversy. She understood that being a public figure meant opening herself to criticism and that not everyone would agree with her methods or message, but she believed the cause was too important to abandon because of negative voices. In October 2014, just over 2 years after the attack that nearly killed her, Malala received the news that would cement her place in history. She was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming at age 17 the youngest person ever to receive the honor. She shared the prize with Kailash Satyarthi, an Indian children's rights activist, highlighting the collaboration between Pakistan and India on an issue that transcended their political tensions. The Nobel Committee recognized her struggle for the right of all children to education, noting that despite her youth, she had already fought for several years for this right, and had shown by example that children and young people too can contribute to improving their own situations. The announcement brought celebrations from supporters around the world and renewed attention to the cause of girls' education. For Malala, the prize was not about personal glory, but about validation for all the girls who were still fighting to go to school and recognition that their struggle mattered on the world stage. The Nobel Prize ceremony in Oslo was a momentous occasion. Malala wore traditional Pakistani clothing, a symbol of her pride and her heritage despite being unable to safely return to her homeland. In her acceptance speech, she dedicated the prize to all the voiceless children who want education, to all the frightened children who want peace, and to all those who fight for their rights. She spoke about visiting refugee camps where she met girls who had lost their homes, their families, their childhoods, but still harbored dreams of education and better futures. She called on world leaders to make education a priority, to invest in schools instead of weapons, to realize that educating girls was not just a moral imperative, but an economic and social one that would benefit entire communities and nations. She emphasized that she was not against anyone, not even the militants who shot her, but that she was for education, for peace, for change, for making the world a place where every child could learn and grow and reach their full potential. The speech was characteristically humble, focusing not on her own achievements, but on the collective work that still needed to be done and the millions of children who were still waiting for their chance to go to school. Life as the youngest Nobel laureate came with opportunities and pressures that continued to shape Malala's teenage years. She balanced attending school in Birmingham with traveling the world for speaking engagements, meeting with world leaders, and managing the growing operations of the Malala Fund. It was an extraordinary existence for someone who should have been focused on homework, friends, and typical adolescent concerns. She had to grow up faster than most people her age, carrying responsibilities that would challenge even seasoned adults. Yet she maintained a determination to complete her own education, understanding that she could not credibly advocate for others to attend school if she did not prioritize her own learning. She studied hard, preparing for her A-level exams while also writing a memoir and continuing her advocacy work. Her time management skills had to be exceptional, and she relied on her family for support and grounding. The memoir, titled I Am Malala and co-written with journalist Christina Lamb, was published in October 2013 and became an international bestseller. In it, Malala told her story in her own words, from her childhood in Swat Valley through the attack and her recovery. The book provided insights into her thoughts, her fears, her family dynamics, and her unwavering commitment to education. It humanized her beyond the headlines and the speeches, showing readers the person behind the symbol. She wrote about missing her home in Pakistan, about the friends she had left behind, about the simple pleasures of her life before everything changed. The book was translated into dozens of languages and introduced her story to millions of people who might never attend a UN speech or a Nobel ceremony. It also generated revenue that supported the Malala Fund's work, turning her story into a resource for the cause she championed. However, the book also generated controversy, particularly in Pakistan. Some criticized her portrayal of Islam and Pakistani culture, claiming she presented her country in an overly negative light to appeal to Western audiences. Others took issue with specific passages or interpretations of events. The book was banned in private schools across Pakistan, with officials claiming it did not show enough respect for Islam and the country. This hurt Malala deeply, as she had always maintained her love for Pakistan and her identity as a proud Pakistani Muslim. She had never intended to disparage her faith or her homeland, but rather to shed light on the specific problems caused by extremism and to advocate for positive change. The criticism from her own country highlighted the complex position she occupied, celebrated globally but controversial at home, unable to return to Pakistan without serious security risks, yet constantly defending her Pakistani identity to international audiences. As Malala continued her education, she also expanded the reach and impact of the Malala Fund. The organization developed a more sophisticated approach to education advocacy, moving beyond simply building schools to addressing the systemic barriers that kept girls out of classrooms. They worked on changing laws that discriminated against girls, on challenging cultural practices that prioritized boys' education over girls, on addressing child marriage and child labor that pulled children out of school, and on dealing with poverty that made education unaffordable for many families. The fund supported local activists who understood their communities and could work for change from within, rather than imposing Western solutions on non-Western contexts. This approach recognized that education issues varied greatly from one place to another, and that sustainable change required local ownership and leadership. In countries like Nigeria, where Boko Haram militants had kidnapped hundreds of schoolgirls, the Malala Fund worked to support the return of these girls to education and to strengthen community resolve to keep schools open despite threats. In Afghanistan, they supported programs that trained female teachers and created safe spaces for girls to learn. In Pakistan, despite the controversy surrounding Malala herself, the fund worked with local partners to support girls' secondary education in regions where cultural barriers were strongest. In refugee camps in Kenya, Lebanon, and other countries, they supported education programs for displaced children who had lost access to schooling due to conflict and migration. Each context presented unique challenges, but the fundamental goal remained the same: ensuring that every girl had the opportunity to complete 12 years of quality education. Malala also used her platform to connect education advocacy to other global issues. She spoke about the links between education and poverty reduction, noting that educated women were more likely to earn higher incomes, have smaller families, and invest in their children's health and education. She highlighted how education could combat extremism by providing young people with critical thinking skills and opportunities beyond violence. She connected education to gender equality, environmental sustainability, and economic development, making the case that investing in girls' education was one of the most effective ways to address multiple global challenges simultaneously. Her advocacy matured from a focus on access to school buildings to a more comprehensive understanding of quality education, relevant curricula, trained teachers, and safe learning environments. As she approached the end of her secondary education, Malala had to make decisions about her future. She could have chosen any number of paths given her fame and resources. Some expected her to pursue politics, perhaps eventually returning to Pakistan to run for office. Others imagined her continuing as a full-time activist and nonprofit leader. But Malala wanted to continue her own education at the university level, to deepen her knowledge and to model the importance of lifelong learning. She applied to several prestigious universities and ultimately received an acceptance from Oxford University to study philosophy, politics, and economics. The same university that had educated numerous world leaders and change-makers would now educate the youngest Nobel laureate. For Malala, getting into Oxford represented a personal dream fulfilled, proof that she had overcome not only the bullet that was meant to kill her, but also the disruption to her education that the attack had caused. Starting at Oxford in 2017 was another transition in Malala's extraordinary journey. She moved into student accommodations, attended lectures and seminars, and tried to experience university life as normally as possible despite the security that still surrounded her. Her fellow students were generally respectful of her privacy, and she made efforts to be seen as just another student rather than as a celebrity or a symbol. She joined clubs, studied in libraries, ate in dining halls, and navigated the same academic challenges as her peers. Yet she could not entirely escape her public role, and she continued to use her voice to advocate for education during university breaks and through social media. She met with world leaders who visited Oxford, continued to guide the work of the Malala Fund, and maintained her commitment to the cause that had defined her life since childhood. During her university years, Malala worked to balance her studies with her continued advocacy, a juggling act that required careful time management and clear priorities. She was determined to have as typical a university experience as possible, to learn from her professors and classmates, to engage with new ideas, and to grow intellectually in ways that would strengthen her future work. At the same time, the Malala Fund continued to expand its reach and impact, and she remained the organization's most visible representative and most effective fundraiser. She traveled during university breaks to visit Malala Fund programs in different countries, meeting with the girls whose education her organization supported, and with the local activists who were implementing change in their communities. These visits kept her grounded in the reality of the work, reminding her of why she had started this journey and whom she was fighting for. The global education landscape was evolving during these years, with new challenges and opportunities emerging. The international community had adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which included a specific goal to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all by 2030. This gave education advocates like Malala a framework and timeline to push governments and international organizations toward concrete action. However, progress was uneven, and in many places, the barriers to girls' education remained stubbornly persistent. Conflicts in Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, and other countries created millions of refugee children who lacked access to schooling. Economic pressures and climate change disrupted education in vulnerable communities. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began during Malala's final year at university, created unprecedented challenges for education worldwide, with school closures affecting over 1 billion children globally. The pandemic particularly impacted girls, many of whom faced increased risks of child marriage, domestic labor, and permanent dropout from school during the closures. The Malala Fund quickly pivoted to address these challenges, advocating for girls to be prioritized in school reopening plans and supporting distance learning programs in communities where they were feasible. Malala used her platform to call attention to the education crisis created by the pandemic, urging governments not to cut education funding despite economic pressures and warning about the long-term consequences of a lost generation of learners. She also highlighted the digital divide that left many girls without access to online learning, emphasizing that technology alone was not a solution if students lacked devices, internet connectivity, or safe spaces to learn from home. Despite the challenges posed by the pandemic, Malala completed her degree at Oxford, graduating in 2020 with her undergraduate degree. The graduation ceremony, like so much else that year, was affected by COVID restrictions, but the achievement remained significant. She had fulfilled her dream of completing university, had proven that the attack could not derail her education, and had equipped herself with deeper knowledge to inform her advocacy work. Her graduation was celebrated by supporters around the world, who had followed her journey from the young blogger in Swat Valley to the Nobel laureate to the Oxford graduate. For her parents, watching their daughter graduate from one of the world's most prestigious universities was a moment of profound pride and relief, a testament to her resilience and to their decision years earlier to support her education and her voice despite the risks. After graduating, Malala continued to evolve in her role as an education advocate and global voice for girls' rights. She signed a partnership with Apple TV to produce documentaries and series focused on education, women's rights, and social justice issues. She expanded her presence on social media, using platforms like Instagram and Twitter to reach younger audiences and to share stories of girls fighting for education around the world. She also became more vocal on issues beyond education, speaking out about refugee rights, climate justice, and other causes that intersected with her core mission. Her advocacy matured from the passionate, but sometimes simple appeals of her teenage years to more sophisticated analysis of systemic issues and more strategic approaches to creating change. In 2021, Malala took a deeply personal step that brought both joy and controversy. She married Asir Malik, a manager with the Pakistan Cricket Board, in a small ceremony in Birmingham. The marriage was announced through her social media, where she shared photos and expressed her happiness. For Malala, this was a private decision about her personal life, a choice to share her future with someone she loved. However, the announcement sparked debate, particularly regarding her previous comments in an interview where she had questioned the necessity of marriage. Some critics accused her of hypocrisy, while supporters defended her right to change her views and to make personal choices without public judgment. Others in more conservative circles who had already criticized her found new reasons to attack her, claiming she had become too westernized or had betrayed traditional values. The controversy highlighted the impossible standards often applied to public figures, especially young women, who are expected to be perfect symbols rather than complex humans who grow and change over time. The personal milestone of marriage did not slow Malala's professional work. She continued to lead the Malala Fund, which had grown into a significant force in global education advocacy, with programs in multiple countries and partnerships with major organizations and governments. The fund published research on girls' education, trained and supported local education activists, invested in schools and programs, and advocated for policy changes at national and international levels. Malala remained the face of the organization, but she worked to elevate the voices of other activists, particularly those from the countries and communities where the work was happening. She understood that sustainable change required local leadership, and that her role was to use her platform to amplify others rather than to center herself in every story. As she entered her mid-20s, Malala reflected on how far she had come from that schoolgirl in Swat Valley who just wanted to learn and wanted other girls to have the same opportunity. She had survived an assassination attempt, had become the youngest Nobel laureate, had graduated from Oxford, had built a global organization, had met with countless world leaders, and had inspired millions of people around the world. Yet the work was far from finished. Despite all the progress and attention, millions of girls were still out of school, still facing barriers based on their gender, still being denied the education that could transform their lives and their communities. The challenge Malala faced was maintaining urgency and attention for an issue that could seem intractable, continuing to push for change even when progress was slow, and sustaining hope even when setbacks occurred. The scope of the challenge Malala and the education advocacy community faced was staggering in its complexity. According to UNESCO, approximately 130 million girls worldwide were out of school, denied education due to poverty, conflict, discrimination, child marriage, and other barriers. In some regions, cultural beliefs that girls should focus on domestic duties rather than academics meant that even when schools were available, families chose not to send their daughters. In conflict zones, schools were deliberately targeted by armed groups who saw education, especially for girls, as a threat to their ideology and control. In areas affected by extreme poverty, families had to choose which children to educate when resources were limited, and boys were often prioritized. Child marriage pulled millions of girls out of school each year, ending their education and their childhood simultaneously. Natural disasters and climate change disrupted schooling in vulnerable communities, with girls often the last to return when schools reopened. Malala and the Malala Fund worked to address these interconnected challenges through multiple approaches. They supported grassroots organizations that understood local contexts and could work within communities to change attitudes and remove barriers. They funded programs that provided financial support to families, making it economically feasible to keep girls in school. They advocated for laws banning child marriage and requiring girls' education, then worked to ensure those laws were enforced. They supported teacher training programs that equipped educators to create safe, inclusive learning environments. They pushed for curriculum reforms that made education relevant and engaging for girls. They worked to ensure that schools had proper facilities, including separate bathrooms for girls, which research showed was critical for keeping girls in school once they reached puberty. Each intervention was evidence-based, designed to address specific barriers in specific contexts. One of the Malala Fund's significant initiatives was the Gulmakai Network, which provided funding and support to local education advocates in regions where girls faced the greatest challenges. Rather than implementing programs directly, the fund empowered local leaders who were already working for change in their communities. This approach recognized that outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned, could not understand local contexts as deeply as those who lived them. The network supported activists in countries including Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Brazil, India, and others, providing them with resources, training, networking opportunities, and a connection to global advocacy efforts. These local champions became the real force for change, with Malala and the fund serving to amplify their work and secure resources they needed. Throughout this period, Malala continued to use her voice and platform strategically. She wrote op-eds for major newspapers calling attention to education crises. She met with political leaders during key decision-making moments to advocate for education funding and policies. She spoke at international conferences, keeping girls' education on the global agenda. She used social media to share stories of individual girls overcoming barriers to education, humanizing the statistics and reminding her audience that behind every number was a real person with dreams and potential. She also increasingly connected education advocacy to other global movements, building coalitions with climate activists, refugee advocates, women's rights organizations, and others who shared overlapping goals. The work took her to some of the most challenging places on Earth. She visited refugee camps where Syrian girls who had fled violence in their homeland were trying to continue their education in temporary schools with limited resources. She met with Nigerian girls who had been kidnapped by Boko Haram and had escaped or been rescued. Hearing their stories of trauma and their determination to return to school despite everything they had endured. She traveled to rural areas of Pakistan, though always with heavy security, to see Malala Fund programs supporting girls' secondary education in regions where cultural barriers were strongest. She visited Brazil to meet girls advocating for education in their favela communities. Each visit reinforced her understanding of both the universal nature of the challenge and the unique barriers in different contexts. One particularly significant moment came when Malala finally returned to Pakistan for a visit in 2018. More than 5 years after the attack that had forced her into exile. The return was brief, only about 4 days, and was conducted with extraordinary security measures. She met with government officials, including the Prime Minister, and made emotional appeals for Pakistan to prioritize education and to ensure that all children, especially girls, could attend school safely. She also returned to Swat Valley briefly, seeing her hometown for the first time since leaving for school that October morning in 2012. The visit was deeply emotional for Malala and her family, a homecoming that they had dreamed about during the years of exile. However, it also highlighted that she still could not return permanently or move freely in her own country due to ongoing security threats. The militants who had tried to kill her had been captured and convicted, but the ideology that motivated the attack remained present in some parts of Pakistani society. The visit to Pakistan sparked mixed reactions. Many Pakistanis welcomed her return and celebrated her achievements, viewing her as a source of national pride. Others remained critical, seeing her as someone who had criticized Pakistan to gain Western approval and support. Some questioned why she did not return permanently if she truly loved her country as she claimed. These criticisms revealed the complicated relationship between Malala and Pakistan, a relationship marked by pride and suspicion, celebration and resentment, love and distance. Malala continued to identify strongly as Pakistani, wearing Pakistani clothes, speaking Urdu, maintaining Pakistani cultural practices, and defending her country when foreigners criticized it. Yet she could not safely live in the country of her birth, and some in that country viewed her with hostility rather than as the hero she was considered elsewhere. As Malala moved through her 20s, she also grappled with questions about her own future and identity. She had become famous for speaking out as a child, had built her advocacy during her teenage years, and had established herself as a global leader in her early 20s. But who was she beyond the cause that had defined her life? What did she want for herself personally, separate from her public mission? These were questions that many young people face, but for Malala they were complicated by the extraordinary circumstances of her life. She could not simply decide to step away from public life when millions of people around the world saw her as the face of girls' education. Yet she also deserved to have her own life, her own interests, her own identity beyond being the girl who was shot for going to school. As the years passed, Malala worked to define a version of her advocacy that felt sustainable for the long term. She had learned from her university years that completely separating her personal life from her public work was impossible, but she also recognized the need for boundaries and balance. She became more selective about which speaking engagements to accept, more strategic about which meetings and events would advance the cause most effectively. She empowered other leaders within the Malala Fund to take on more visible roles, both to build organizational sustainability and to share the spotlight with others whose work deserved recognition. She also pursued interests outside of education advocacy, though she understood that everything she did would be viewed through the lens of her public identity. The Malala Fund continued to mature as an organization, developing more sophisticated measurement systems to track impact and to ensure that investments were achieving intended outcomes. They published annual reports showing how many girls had been reached through their programs, how policies had changed as a result of their advocacy, and how local activists they supported were creating change in their communities. They also grappled with difficult questions about how to measure long-term impact, how to attribute changes to their work versus other factors, and how to balance the need for impact stories with the privacy and dignity of the girls they served. These organizational growing pains were normal for a nonprofit scaling up quickly, but they required careful attention to maintain credibility and effectiveness. One of the fund's major initiatives was advocating for increased global spending on girls' education, particularly secondary education. Research showed that educating girls through secondary school yielded enormous returns in terms of economic growth, health outcomes, gender equality, and social stability. Yet international aid for education was declining, and secondary education for girls received a tiny fraction of development funding. The Malala Fund joined with other organizations to call for increased investment, more efficient use of existing resources, and better coordination between governments, international organizations, and nonprofits. They produced reports showing the gap between current funding and what was needed to achieve universal girls' education, and they lobbied donor countries to increase their commitments. Malala also began to speak more about the quality of education, not just access. Getting girls into schools was crucial, but if those schools failed to provide meaningful learning, the promise of education remained unfulfilled. She highlighted issues like poorly trained teachers, overcrowded classrooms, lack of relevant curriculum, and teaching methods that relied on rote memorization rather than critical thinking. She called for investments in teacher training, in developing culturally relevant curricula that prepared students for real-world challenges, and in creating learning environments that were safe and engaging. This shift toward quality reflected a maturing understanding that education reform required systemic changes, not just building schools and getting children through the doors. Throughout these years, Malala maintained a connection to her roots in Swat Valley and to Pakistan more broadly, even while living in England. She supported education initiatives in Pakistan through the Malala Fund, maintained relationships with Pakistani activists and organizations, and spoke out about issues affecting her home country. When devastating floods hit Pakistan in 2022, affecting millions of people and destroying thousands of schools, she advocated for international support for recovery efforts and highlighted the particular impact on children's education. When the Pakistani economy faced crises, she called attention to the importance of protecting education spending even during difficult economic times. Her love for Pakistan remained evident, even as her relationship with the country remained complicated by security concerns and by the mixed reception she received from different segments of Pakistani society. Malala also increasingly used her platform to elevate the voices of other young activists, particularly those from marginalized communities whose voices were often overlooked. She featured them in Malala Fund communications, invited them to speak at events alongside her, and used her social media following to amplify their work. She recognized that she had access and influence that others deserved but lacked, and she tried to use that privilege responsibly. This approach reflected a more sophisticated understanding of activism and social change, one that recognized the importance of centering the voices of those most affected by the issues being addressed. It also acknowledged that one person, no matter how famous or well-intentioned, could not speak for all girls everywhere, and that diverse voices and perspectives were essential for effective advocacy. As she approached her late 20s, Malala could look back on over 15 years of activism, from her early blogs as an 11-year-old through her current work as an established global leader. She had witnessed significant progress, with millions more girls in school than when she started, with education higher on the global agenda, with more organizations and governments prioritizing girls' education in their work. She had also witnessed setbacks, including the Taliban's return to power in Afghanistan in 2021, which immediately threatened the educational gains that Afghan girls had made over the previous 2 decades. The situation in Afghanistan was particularly painful for Malala, who had advocated for Afghan girls' education throughout her career, and who saw their futures suddenly placed in jeopardy by political changes beyond their control. The crisis in Afghanistan demonstrated that progress on girls' education was never guaranteed, that gains could be reversed by conflict, by political change, by shifts in ideology and power. It reinforced the need for sustained advocacy and for building movements that could withstand political changes. Malala spoke out forcefully about the situation in Afghanistan, meeting with world leaders to urge them to make girls' education a condition of any recognition or support for the new government. She elevated the voices of Afghan girls and women who were protesting the restrictions on their education and their rights. She worked to ensure that the international community did not forget about Afghan girls even as global attention moved to other crises. The situation tested her optimism, but also reinforced her determination to continue fighting for girls' education regardless of the obstacles. Girls' education regardless of the obstacles. As Malala entered the second decade of her global advocacy work, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from a schoolgirl in Swat Valley to one of the most recognized activists in the world. The path had been marked by violence and trauma, by courage and resilience, by victories and setbacks. She had achieved things that seemed impossible, had inspired millions of people, had helped millions of girls gain access to education. Yet she also understood that the work was far from complete, that the vision she had been fighting for since childhood, a world where every girl could go to school safely and receive a quality education, remained unfulfilled. The challenge moving forward was maintaining momentum, sustaining hope, and continuing to push for change even when progress felt frustratingly slow. The Malala Fund had become a permanent institution in the global education landscape, with significant funding, professional staff, established programs, and strong partnerships with governments, international organizations, and other nonprofits. The organization had evolved beyond being simply Malala's vehicle for advocacy into a sophisticated operation that would continue its work regardless of any one individual. This institutional maturity was essential for long-term impact, ensuring that the cause would be advanced even if Malala herself stepped back or focused on other priorities. She had built something larger than herself, a legacy that extended beyond her personal story to encompass the work of thousands of activists, educators, and girls around the world who were fighting for education in their own communities. Malala herself continued to evolve as a person and as a leader. She had married, had built a life in England while maintaining her Pakistani identity, had pursued her own education to the highest levels, had written multiple books, had produced documentaries, and had become a respected voice on issues far beyond education. She had learned to balance her public role with her need for privacy and personal space. She had developed a more nuanced understanding of social change, recognizing complexity and contradiction rather than seeing issues in simple terms of right and wrong. She had also learned to accept criticism and disagreement, understanding that anyone in public life would face opposition and that not everyone would agree with her methods or message. These lessons had shaped her into a more effective advocate and a more grounded person. Looking at the global education landscape, Malala saw both reasons for hope and causes for concern. On the positive side, there was greater awareness than ever before about the importance of girls' education. More funding dedicated to the cause, more organizations working on these issues, and more girls in school than at any previous point in history. Laws had changed in numerous countries to support girls' education and to ban practices like child marriage that interfered with schooling. Technology had created new opportunities for distance learning and for reaching students in remote areas. A new generation of activists had emerged, inspired partly by Malala's example but bringing their own perspectives and strategies to the work. These were real achievements worth celebrating. However, significant challenges remained. The number of girls out of school, while lower than in previous decades, was still unacceptably high, and progress had stalled in many regions. The poorest and most marginalized girls, those in conflict zones, those with disabilities, those from ethnic minorities, still faced enormous barriers. Climate change was creating new disruptions to education, with extreme weather events destroying schools and displacing communities. Political instability and conflict continued to threaten education systems in many countries. The COVID pandemic had reversed years of progress, with millions of girls who dropped out during school closures still not returned to learning. Economic pressures were forcing governments to cut education budgets in many countries, and the quality of education, even where access had improved, often remained inadequate to prepare students for the challenges they would face. Malala understood that addressing these ongoing challenges would require sustained effort over many more years, probably over her entire lifetime and beyond. She also understood that her role would continue to evolve as she aged, as new voices emerged, as the global context changed. She could not remain the young face of education advocacy forever, nor would she want to. Her goal was to build movements that would outlast her, to empower others to lead, to create systems and institutions that would continue advancing girls' education regardless of any individual personality. This long-term perspective helped her avoid burnout and maintain hope even in the face of setbacks. In her personal life, Malala continued to cherish education and learning for their own sake, not just as an advocacy cause. She read widely, engaged with new ideas, maintained intellectual curiosity about the world. She also worked to protect space for her private life, for relationships and experiences that were separate from her public mission. She had learned that taking care of herself, maintaining her own well-being and happiness, was not selfish but essential for sustaining the work over the long term. She could not be an effective advocate if she was exhausted, burned out, or had sacrificed everything personal to the public cause. This realization represented a kind of wisdom that comes from experience, from having survived extraordinary challenges and emerged with perspective about what truly matters. The story of Malala Yousafzai is not finished, as she continues her work and her life with many years still ahead of her. But the arc of her journey from a young girl in Pakistan who simply wanted to go to school to a global leader who has changed how the world thinks about education represents one of the most remarkable stories of our time. She survived an attempt on her life that would have silenced most people, and she responded by speaking even more loudly and effectively. She took her suffering and trauma and transformed them into a force for positive change that has benefited millions of girls around the world. She has demonstrated courage that inspired countless others to find their own voices and fight for their own rights. She has shown that young people, even children, can be powerful agents of change when they have conviction and commitment to a cause larger than themselves. Her legacy extends beyond the specific achievements of the Malala Fund or the girls who have gone to school because of her advocacy. She has fundamentally changed the global conversation about girls' education, making it a priority that governments and international organizations cannot ignore. She has inspired a generation of young activists who see her example and believe they too can make a difference. She has shown that peaceful resistance and moral clarity can be more powerful than violence and intimidation. She has lived her values with remarkable consistency, never wavering in her commitment to education even when that commitment nearly cost her life. And she has done all of this while maintaining her humanity, her sense of humor, her love for her family and her culture, her ability to connect with people as a person rather than just as a symbol. The question of what Malala will do in the years and decades ahead remains open. She may continue her education advocacy for the rest of her life, or she may shift to other issues as her interests evolve. She may eventually return to Pakistan permanently if security conditions allow, or she may continue building her life in England or elsewhere. She may enter politics, may focus on writing, may take on new challenges in areas beyond education. Whatever path she chooses, she has already secured her place in history as someone who stood up for what she believed in when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent, who survived violence that was meant to eliminate her voice, and who used the platform created by that experience to fight for millions of other girls who needed someone to advocate for their rights and their futures. Her story is a testament to the power of one person to make a difference, to the importance of education as a fundamental human right, and to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of violence and oppression. It is a story that will continue to inspire long after the specific details of her life have faded. A story that reminds us all that courage matters, that standing up for justice matters, and that education truly can change the world.